Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
Exceptionally well, Rory. I hope that you are well too, Rory.
I am. I am. Even though it's raining at Counselling Towers outside, it's a really dirty day here at the tower. But I can tell you that I am very well and grateful for it.
Delighted to hear that. Yeah, it's that time in the United Kingdom where the weather is slightly dreary. The time of making this is autumn, and the mornings are darker. The afternoons, it gets dark earlier. But we have a light, and that is that we are here for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 167. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be doing 3 separate sections today, starting with our student check-in, where we're going to be looking at imposter syndrome. I think, Rory, to be honest, that's going to stretch way beyond just students. I can definitely recognize that within my own life. We then go to our next section, which is the Counselling Digital Revolution, where we look at how technology is now playing a very big part in therapeutic intervention. And we're going to be speaking about therapist boundaries related to working online or via telephone. And then we go into topic number 3, which is our practice matters, where we take something from practice that our qualified practitioner friends might come across. And we're going to be speaking today about ethical problem solving. When you have an ethical dilemma and you need to evidence defensible decision making, what do you do? What's your go-to? So there's our topics, starting us off today. Student check-in, imposter syndrome, Rory.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, you're absolutely right. I have imposter syndrome, and I speak to many people, and it's amazing how many people say, I'm sure someone's going to catch me out. I've got to the top of my profession, but at any minute, someone's going to burst through the door and say you're an imposter, and you're not really good enough. And it's an interesting idea, and it's actually one that comes up a lot in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, but knock on the door. We're a friendly bunch. We'll let you in. And there's thousands and thousands of like-minded people in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have tutors, we have students, lots of students. We have qualified colleagues, a soupçon of lecturers who share their wisdom. And this topic comes up a lot. And it's certainly, I think, very prevalent for students who are maybe going into practice for the first time. They've done their classroom work, they've done their skills work, they've may have done an online telephone and online counselling course, because a lot of people are working online now. They're very well educated, they're very well equipped, but still there's that fear of going into practice. Am I good enough? Am I okay? And certainly when I used to teach, every single year when it came to going into practice, you would have lots of worried students who just felt that they weren't good enough. And a lot of the tutor's work was to say, you've just got to do the best you can, go out and be great in the world. And it's an interesting theory, and it's one actually that Abraham Maslow talked about. He talked about the Jonah complex. He borrowed a biblical story about Jonah and the whale, and he talked really about, he was a bit kind of direct, was Abraham Maslow. He said basically it's a failure to self-actualize. He said that not being confident in yourself is actually you self-defeating yourself. It was a bit, for a humanist, he was a bit of an Albert Ellis, really. He was a bit of a stoic.
Yeah, it's a topic that I think most people will be able to relate to. And it's interesting because it kind of follows in the theme that we've been running lately. So if you go to episode 166 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, you'll notice that we spoke about the self-concept, and we spoke about the Johari window. So basically focusing there on our personal development. And I think that imposter syndrome is a great opportunity for that personal development. And with you speaking about that it kind of comes about as a failure to self-actualize. I can understand that in a way. I can understand that. It's almost clinging on to an irrational belief. And the interesting thing about imposter syndrome is that it doesn't matter how often somebody has done something, what level of education they hold. You can have somebody with a doctorate in a certain topic that will feel imposter syndrome any minute now. And I think you described it, Rory, so well. It's that feeling of any minute now, people are going to see through this facade, and they're going to see me for who I really am. And it's almost for me an incongruence when you're feeling within self, maybe I'm not sure about this, I'm uncertain about this, but the incongruence being, I'm going to put on this view to the world that everything is fine. And within imposter syndrome, I think that's one of the issues, is you kind of look around, and within imposter syndrome, it looks like everyone else has got it sussed. Everyone else's life is sorted. They're all fine. It's just me. I'm the one pretending. Any minute now, they're going to find out.
Absolutely. And I think you sit in a room full of people. I've sat in many rooms full of really well qualified and well-known people. As my father used to say, no names, no pack drill. And I am sure that at any point, some of those people would have been thinking, at any time I'm going to be caught out. And I think part of it's a cultural thing. Certainly, I'm from the north of England, and growing up, I would have heard terms like "don't get too big for your boots," or "your head's so big your cap won't fit."
Yeah,
those are very northern kind of northern English idioms, if you like. And also, I think that there's a sense that when people actually say, "I'm an expert," and I'm going to I know exactly what I'm doing, that there may be a bit of a distrust. I remember a friend of mine many years ago had to have very serious brain surgery, and he met the brain surgeon, and the brain surgeon said, "I'm an expert in my field, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that." And my friend just didn't trust him. He said, "Oh, he's really arrogant, really arrogant." And the proof of the pudding is my friend's still around today.
Wow. Yeah.
So what that surgeon said was, "I'm an expert in my field. I'm an expert in this particular anomaly of the brain. I'm an expert in fixing this particular anomaly in the brain." It wasn't arrogance. It was actually the truth. And the truth played out, because my friend is still around, still gardening, still alive. So sometimes we can see people telling the truth about their expertise as arrogance, when actually it's just the truth about what they can do.
I think there it is. There's once again the cultural flip side of the coin. We talk about the imposter syndrome of feeling unsure but putting out a front that everything is okay. But on the flip side of that, looking at somebody who says, "I am competent in this," and then questioning, "Are they really competent in this?" It's interesting that we have that cultural norm, I guess. And I see imposter syndrome, as I kind of opened up with here, as a unique opportunity to examine self. So if we're feeling unsure, that's okay. And it doesn't matter how long you've been doing something or what level you're at in terms of your education. It's okay to be unsure at times. It's a feeling that is all right. I think that where it becomes an issue is when we kind of pretend that is not true, and play a part that everything is fine. Whereas the unsure feeling can then, because it is trapped, it doesn't get to show itself in the light of day, it doesn't come out, it stays just in your head, it can turn around and it can get darker and darker, and more exaggerated as you go along. And I think therein lies the pain. And I wonder if we went to congruence and kind of stood up and said, "You know what? I'm going to be honest here. I'm actually feeling a little shaky about what I'm about to do today. I'm feeling a little bit unsure about what I'm going to do today." I wonder how that might be received. And I guess it's about how appropriate the situation is, because that's not the thing I would want to hear from my surgeon just before they said, "Anyway, let's count now from 10 to 1 as you go to sleep." I would want the confidence there. But wow, what a great rich opportunity to do some self-growth and maybe, as Maslow say, to self-actualize past. And maybe it's an area for a little bit of CBT where we take the irrational fear and we kind of bring a little bit of evidence in and we kind of dispute the irrational fear, maybe with some evidence.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think it's a rich area for challenge. I was taught, I did a TA 101 many years ago, transactional analysis introduction. And I was taught by an Australian TA therapist who was really, really good. And she told us a story about a client who was incredibly successful and but would slip into a very child ego state and say, oh, I'm not very good. I'm not that. I'm not that good, and and she said to him, "Stop it. We're not doing that today.
Yeah,
we're not. We're not doing that." And I think there's merit in that. To be honest, the times I've said to people, in general, in fact, just recently, I had to say to someone who I work with professionally, not a counsellor, incidentally, we're not doing that today. I was hearing a lot of, I'm saying we're not doing that today. And the person just kind of looked aghast, and I said, "You're quite clearly competent at what you do. You're quite clearly qualified in what you do. I don't want to really, we don't want to be going down that road of, And actually, after the shock had worn off, it was actually, you're right, Rory. I was slipping away into something else.
Yeah. And
sometimes you need to bring that back. And I think that's challenge. And I think sometimes, certainly in the person-centered lexicon, it's not that recognised, but it's very useful. The times my supervisor said to me, "We're not going down that road today, Rory." In other words, she wasn't giving me permission to slide away into a load of anxiety. It was like, no, that is not actually, Rory, what's happening here.
Yeah, it's not kind of letting that child ego state have its free reign and its free run. It's kind of closing that down and going straight back to the let's sit with the adult ego state. And it's also, I mean, you're speaking about TA. We're not doing that today. It's not even a critical parent, interestingly enough. It really does sit there right within the adult ego state, which will pull the person up. And I recognize that. You started going into this, Rory, you were speaking about maybe the student who's going into their first client hour or something like that and feeling that imposter syndrome. And I think there are times when the stakes are pretty high, that first client hour is a big deal. It really is a big deal. And the emotions that you feel, the trepidation that you might feel towards that is justified in that you only feel like that because you really care. If you didn't care about that client and the outcome, you'd have no worries because you wouldn't care, but you do care. And you do care. So it's okay to have those feelings and to acknowledge those feelings. I think where it can be damaging is when it is carried for a prolonged period of time, when you are internalizing it over and over again. And if you find yourself in that situation, then this is great for personal therapy. And it doesn't matter what level you're at. You can be practicing for 15 years. If you're carrying it around with you and you're carrying it around for some time and it's not shifting, get yourself into personal therapy because that's a great place to work on a topic like this.
Absolutely. And I think there's a role for trainers. When I used to teach, in the first, maybe not the first week, but the second week, I would ask everybody in the circle to just put their hands on the underside of the chair if they could and just feel the underside of the chair, just pull up on the chair. And they'd all kind of look at me quizzically. And I would say to them, the reason I've asked you to do that, can you feel the chair? Can you feel the connection to the chair? And they'd say, yeah. I said, well, the reason I want you to do that is because every single person who sat in that chair has earned their place.
Absolutely, Rory. I love that because what you're doing is you're using a physical action to kind of interact with that emotion that they may be feeling inside. It is a really interesting topic, and I believe, Rory, that you have created a super duper handout on this.
Oh yes, the super duper handout is waiting for you right now. You go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go down to podcast 167, You'll find it there. Just click on it. You can download it. And it explains Maslow's idea of the Jonah complex and also imposter syndrome in general. It's a really useful handout. And I would suggest that you pop it in the front of your folder. So on those days where you're feeling less than brilliant, that you can have a look at it and just remind yourself that it is a psychological process that happens, and B, you are brilliant. Maybe you should put "I'm brilliant" at the front of your folder just to remind you. But yeah, you can have a look at that, and it's just a useful resource. But imposter syndrome or the Jonah complex is really not unusual, I don't think, for anybody. There may be some exceptions I could think of, but generally speaking, I think it affects everybody from time to time.
It does, and it is an important topic. And I will share with you, we have a resource for students of counselling called the Counselling Study Resources, or CSR as we call it. And within CSR, we have lectures and resources that kind of underpin formal counselling studies. And one of the topics is self-development, because we bring ourselves to the centre of our practice. And we've got a lecture in Counselling Study Resource on this very, very topic, on imposter syndrome. So if you are a member, log into your CSR and just pop in self-development or imposter syndrome. That's going to come up for you. And if you're not a member of Counselling Study Resources and you want to check out what we have on offer, just go to counsellingtutor.com. All of the details are, of course, there on our website. So that is our student check-in. And as we kind of move away from student check-in, we enter what we call the Counselling Digital Revolution, where we acknowledge that technology is now very much becoming part of therapeutic delivery, the way that we deliver therapy and the way that clients engage in therapy. And today we're going to be speaking about therapist boundaries related to online work. So without any further ado, let's dive, we're going to dive, Rory, straight into that pool, which is the Counselling Digital Revolution.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it, that we find ourselves at this point of our society, a lot of therapists working online via phone, maybe through a video link like Ken and myself are using now. And it brings up an interesting new ethical dynamic, and that is boundaries. In episode 162, I talked about the disinhibition effect, the idea that when people work online, they may become a bit disinhibited. Clients may search you out online. They may push the boundaries a bit. And I think it's really, really important that anybody who works online revisits their boundaries, has a little bit of a think, maybe talk to their supervisor about what kind of things may come up. And I'm going to give you some examples. I think as soon as you work online, then you're kind of connected to the online world, not only just by the fact you're using, online communication. Sometimes I think clients can get a little bit confused and their boundaries may slip as well. And I'm sure that there's a lot of therapists listening to this, maybe students, maybe qualified colleagues, who are on social media under their own names. And there's a very good chance that your clients look you up. I know I get locked up, not locked up. Some people might say I need locking up, but looked up a lot. And I know that anybody who's kind of has a profile online does get searched for. And I think it's really, really important that when you are an online therapist, you're very thoughtful of boundaries. Things like clients contacting you across social media platforms. If you're a telephone counsellor, making sure that you're really clear when you're available. A telephone is something that can be picked up and used all the time, unlike a therapy room. So, if someone's seeing you for face-to-face therapy in a room, they can't just wander in the room and hope you'll find you there. But it's very tempting with a mobile phone, if someone's having difficulties, just to phone up the therapist. And I think sometimes you really got to have really strong boundaries around that. And I also think that it's very, very easy on the opposite side, if you are a therapist that's working on the phone, to have unconscious processes around who this client is, this kind of voice or sound of the person on the phone, I think can sometimes play into fantasy for therapists. And as a consequence of that, there's a danger that that therapists may fantasize about who their clients are. So I think that in terms of boundaries, I think it's a really good discussion to have with your supervisor. And if it comes up, if a client does contact you on social media or a client does phone you up outside of hours, work with your supervisor to have some kind of plan to manage that boundary, because it can very easily become very blurred. And in our world, we need boundaries to be very, very clear for both the therapist and the client.
Yeah, bingo. It's that clarity. And, when we're speaking about boundaries now, and we're putting it here in Counselling Digital Revolution, which is, we're talking about online, but are boundaries in a face-to-face relationship not the same as online? Well, boundaries are boundaries. So if you are working in a face-to-face relationship, you're going to have your contract. Now, the contract is one thing, and boundaries kind of may be mentioned in your contract, but they sit alongside that. It's almost like it's the framework. Clear boundaries promote trust in the practitioner and provide clarity about the purpose and nature of the relationship. And boundaries are something that exist in any relationship. So we're not talking counseling now, we're talking any relationship. Parental-child relationship has got boundaries in it. Partners have got boundaries, and friends, there's some element of boundaries, and often those boundaries are unspoken. And often those boundaries are found when one person might overstep the boundary, like a child might overstep a boundary, and then the parent might step in and go, that's going one step too far, and now a clear boundary has now been shown after it has been overstepped. And what we're called on in our therapeutic relationship is to outline the boundaries before they are overstepped, so that the client knows what the boundaries are and where the boundaries sit. And we can't assume. So in the same way as we need to practice boundaries within our face-to-face relationships, we now, when working digitally, need to consider, how does digital working differ, and what are the differences in boundaries now that I'm working online?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the temptations that may be about is, if you're working with a client and you've got their details, you may have their home address, you may have their full name, and you're working on the phone and you can't see who they are. I'm sure that there are some people who may be tempted to think, I'll just look them up online purely so I know who I'm looking at, so I can see a picture. And I think that can be a bit of a slippery slope, because, clients are, as we are, entitled to our private lives. And, I would say that and I think ethical bodies would say the same thing too. Looking clients up online is not a great idea, even if the idea behind it is, well, if I see someone's face, I'll be a better therapist because I'll be able to see who they are. And I think that can be a road to difficulty, and certainly one that's led to sanctions being put against therapists who've actively looked on people's social media profiles, especially LinkedIn. That LinkedIn, of course, actually registers who's looked on your profile. So, I think that can be a form of fantasy transference, fantasy, subconscious processes. All those have to be managed. And I think just on a technical level, having a separate phone for your practice, to your personal phone, one you can switch off, I think is a really good idea. That way, if a client is tempted to ring you outside sessions, then you're not going to be available, rather like if they turned up at your practice rooms and you weren't there. I think this is such a new aspect of counselling that I'm sure there's going to be lots of redrawing and rethinking of boundaries. And I think you're absolutely right, Ken. It lives in the contract. Absolutely lives in the contract.
Well, they're partners, aren't they? Boundaries in the contract. And you've been speaking about personal boundaries, a boundary like not going and looking up a client. And those personal boundaries are things that you will put in place yourself and maybe work with your supervisor. It's very unlikely that you might mention to a client that you didn't even go and look them up on LinkedIn. You wouldn't that wouldn't even maybe occur to them. So there are those personal boundaries, but there are also the boundaries on which that the therapy is offered. So if you just take the regular boundaries that we would have when counselling face to face, we would boundary around the time that the counselling was going to take place, the number of sessions, and the location. And very often the location would be the therapy room. And the challenge here is now have a think of how that applies to online and how it differs online. So we look at time. So if the person, maybe you are counselling via the telephone, well, time could then be a little looser because they might phone you back. Whereas if it's in your rooms face to face, they're going to arrive at the right time because that is the time of the session. But you keep that same boundary if you're working online. Number of sessions, how many sessions you might be working together. And then here's another one, location. So if you're working face to face, well, location's pretty simple. It's going to be the room that the client comes to. Do we have to think about location when working online? Yes, we do. We need to boundary that, because what you don't want, and this has happened, is you getting to the time that it's time to connect to this client. You connect to the client and they're driving their car and it's on speakerphone with a passenger, or they're at the shops, or they're in a room where they can be overheard. So location would be boundaried up beforehand of where is appropriate to have the session. So it's about going over the basic boundaries and re-looking at them and saying, how does this apply when working online or via the telephone? And I think that it's not for us to say this is what you should do and this is what you should be doing. It's about you looking for your own practice and really having some time to think about that and reflect about that and making the changes to your boundaries for yourself and your practice.
Absolutely. And I think that boundaries is always going to be a perennial part of your practice, because there will be people who push boundaries, and maybe for the best of reasons your boundaries may become a bit wobbly. And I think that good supervisors will bring that up regularly in supervision meetings, and if they hear an issue around boundaries, it's something to be discussed. But it is very different. I think the whole point of this, it's very different working online. You have to think about your boundaries a lot more because you're working in a different environment. And I'm with you, Ken. Even things like making sure that you're in the same, as a therapist, you're in the same location every time you see a client. If I had, when I was in practice, if I couldn't get the room I usually used and we had to go to another room, I would say, when I was face-to-face counselling, I would say, I'm just aware we're in a different room. I just wonder how that feels for you, because the room provides the security and the kind of stabilisation sometimes that clients need. And if you're going online and your background's changing every 5 minutes, it's equivalent to hopping in and out of rooms. That's a boundary issue, I think.
I agree.
Yeah. So there's a lot to be thought about. And I think sometimes when moving into new environments, there are things that we just don't know. We just don't consider. It's only when something happens that we go, oh gosh, I didn't realise that. So I think if you are working online, maybe having a conversation with boundaries, professional conversation with a peer, colleague, or with your supervisor, just to get it really clear in your mind.
I agree. Go over the boundaries that you would have created for your face-to-face practice. Ask those questions. How does this apply to online? And then add another layer, and whoever your professional body is, go and get your ethical framework and relook at it. Relook at what that ethical framework and look where the boundaries are. So, Rory, you were speaking before about social media, and I'm just using BACP as an example here. Of course, you may be with National Counselling Society or any of the professional bodies, but 2018 BACP Ethical Framework update addresses the issue of social media use, which you mentioned, Rory, and it says reasonable care is taken to separate and maintain a distinction between our personal and professional presence on social media where this could result in harmful dual relationships with clients. And that is taken from the framework. So just looking over the framework can kind of infer what boundaries we might be looking at specifically with working online. And of course, one of the big areas is confidentiality. Confidentiality is a boundary. We hold that confidentiality, but educating our client on how to keep the confidentiality on their side as well. Do they have a shared email address? Can their speakers of their system be overheard from another room? Can they be heard on their telephone from a different room? Can somebody maybe who has access to their phone see who's been phoning them or who they are phoning? We need to really consider this. And I think when it comes to online work, this is why the professional bodies suggest that you undertake formal training to work safely and ethically with your clients. And if you're interested, Counselling Tutor, we offer a online and telephone counselling training course. We've had, at the time of this recording, over 7,000 therapists graduate through that course, and we have over 1,000 reviews from your peers that have taken this course. And if you're interested in having a look at that course, just go to counsellingtutor.com and all of the information is available there. So there it is, that Counselling Digital Revolution, and we now move on to Practice Matters, where we look at what we may come across in our practice as qualified practitioners. And today, I think a really important topic, and that is that of ethical problem solving. So without any further ado, into Practice Matters.
Practice Matters.
Yes, I don't think there is any practitioner who's ever practiced counselling for any length of time that hasn't come up with an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is where you are faced with a problem that you need to really think through in the best interests of your client and sometimes yourself. And I think that in recent years, the term defensible decision making has become a phrase, a term that has come into counselling. When I was first qualified, nobody talked about ethical problem solving too much, although I was taught it on my course, thankfully. And no one at all spoke about defensible decision making. And as the profession's become more professional, more organised, clients have higher expectations now, I think, than they might have done 20 years ago. It's really important that when we're faced with a difficulty in our practice, we are able to evidence our thinking in solving it, or even the evidence of addressing the problem. We may not be able to solve it, and I think that's a big takeaway for ethical problem solving. It's very, very possible that we may not get a great outcome either way, but we have to evidence the process of our thinking should we be brought in front of an ethics committee. And I was speaking to a colleague at an ethical body, and that the person was saying to me that one of the difficulties a lot of therapists face if they're ever having to speak to an ethical body about a complaint is that they cannot adequately evidence a set of thinking that's linked to ethics as a way of handling it. And that's where people really become unstuck. So it's really important that if you are any form of therapist, you could be a hypnotherapist, a psychotherapist, a counsellor. I think in any walk of life where you're working with the general public, you have some form of ethical decision-making grid. And I'm struck, our friends at the National Counselling Society have actually published a blog post on this, and it's called Responding to Ethical Dilemmas. I'm going to put the link into the show notes page. So if you go to episode 167, you'll be able to see that link. But they talk about ethical dilemmas can arise in any situation, such as social, online, mobile, media, and communication. Very strong link to our last topic in the podcast. How to manage your cause for concern, when to disclose or not to disclose. That's your personal disclosure. Issues related to confidentiality, issues relating to professional boundaries, and issues that may challenge your own moral standing. And it's a really, really interesting read. And such an important part of counselling, and thankfully it's one that's being taught a lot now. Ethical problem solving, ethical dilemmas, linked to the ethical framework is something that supervisors should be talking to their supervisees about, I think, in most supervision sessions, Ken.
Agreed. And the truth is, you're going to be in a situation where you may need to make a decision in your practice. It happens time and time again. And because counseling, it has a foundation of ethics, when we're making a decision, we are really making an ethical decision. And you spoke about defendable decision making, Rory. And this is the key. Whatever decision you make, you need to be able to evidence how you came to that decision, not just I sat there and I thought that was the best idea at the time. Why? So what is a defendable decision? It is a decision that demonstrates a structured approach to the problem. And you need to evidence that. And that evidences the steps taken to come to that conclusion. So what did you do to come to the conclusion? And you need to document this. You need to note it down. And you can, of course, put this in your client notes if it's related to a client, or you can keep it separately if it's a different kind of dilemma. And demonstrates terms of reference for the decision. So if you go to law, they might cite different cases that have happened in the past of why they're making a decision right now. So you want a term of reference for why you are making your decision, and a decision that shows a systematic approach to thinking, as opposed to I thought it was a good idea. Are you working with a system? And there are ethical problem-solving systems available. I know that Professor Tim Bond created a ethical problem-solving matrix, which kind of walks through a systematic approach. But that gives you your defendable decision-making. It's how you can evidence that. And Rory, you mentioned the National Counselling Society in a great blog. And if you look at whoever your professional body is, if you go and look at the ethical framework, there will be some kind of mention to responding to ethical dilemmas and issues if you read. So for as an example, in the BACP ethical framework, we recognize that professional and ethical issues, problems and dilemmas will arise from time to time and are unavoidable part of our practice. And then it goes on to walk us through the fact that we'll be called on to make defendable decision making. And I guess why? And the reason is, it's what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if a complaint is laid for a decision that you made? What happens if you find yourself in court because of a decision that was made? It is then that your defensible decision-making process is so important, that you can evidence a documented, structured approach to how you handled and solved that problem.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that, our friends at the BACP, they have downloadable ethical problem-solving grid. And we've also covered this before. I think that this topic is such an important topic. You may hear us talking about it again. Those of you who've followed the podcast from its inception will probably remember the April edition in 2016, where we talked about ethical problem-solving. And if you go to the website, counsellingtutor.com, click on episode 12 of the podcast. That ethical dilemma decision-making grid is there. You can download that as well. But it is just so important. And it's so important that when you go, I think it's so important that I hope it's taught in colleges and universities. When I did my training, I was very fortunate in that we had a whole lesson on it, and we had to have an ethical problem, and then we had to use the problem-solving grid, and the outcomes were really interesting. And initially, we had all of the same problem, and initially, all the groups had different solutions. And it got quite heated at one point in that somebody was saying, well, I don't think that's ethical. And the tutor, who was super wise, said, just because someone's chosen a different decision doesn't mean it's not ethical. And I think that's a really important thing to carry. You could have the same two therapists could have the same issue, and they may deal with it in completely different ways, and both of those ways could be completely ethical. So I think that talks about the kind of pluralism in our profession, and the learning in that session was brilliant, because we not only learned about how we would deal with a situation, we also learned to deal or heard how other people deal with it. And I think that sometimes, gaining peers' advice or colleagues' advice, running it past a colleague, running it past your supervisor will give you a wider view of the situation. So I think the message is, if you are faced with an ethical dilemma, use a problem-solving matrix, gain supervision. You could contact the ethical bodies. They have ethical advisors who will advise you on ethics. So you can use your membership to good effect there. Don't do it on your own, and don't think that it's just a good idea to do it. You have to evidence it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting that this topic comes up today, Rory, because only in this last week, my daughter, she's at college and she has to do a research project, and she is studying environmental conservation. So her research project is that she's taken water, plant material and soil from the pond at their college, and is examining how the life within the jar that it now sits in, how that kind of progresses and how that plays out for a year. And that's her research project. It's called an ecosphere. It creates a self-sustaining ecosystem. But within the jar are some invertebrates, like a little water beetle and a water boatman, and they will not survive. They're not going to survive this because they don't have the rest of their community to mate and to continue their lifespan. And she sat with a ethical dilemma. Do I take out the invertebrates, or do I leave them in there because even if they die, they are then going to be food for the rest of the organisms within the jar? And it was really nice that I was able to share ethical problem solving with her. I was able to say, here's an ethical problem solving matrix. Why don't you start out by writing the problem down? You'd be surprised. That's the first step of any ethical problem solving, is write down the problem. You can sometimes be so surprised that when it's actually in words on a piece of paper, how it changes what that ethical dilemma is. And then we went through the ethical problem solving, and it starts off with, whose dilemma is this anyway? And it gives you different choices, considering all the available ethical principles and guidelines that may relate to this. So that we actually went online to search if there were any laws. Is there a law about having a beetle? Because there are, of course, laws in keeping some animals captive. There are conservation laws for animals you wouldn't even think of, like newts, Rory. I found out that there is had it been a newt, we would have been bound by law to let it go, because there is a law protecting it, but there's not a law protecting the beetles. What codes of standards are available? And so this is what we went through with my daughter, and I think that it was really valuable learning. And that's what this is all about. When you come to an ethical problem, you want to have already done the learning. You want to already have put in the hours of CPD to understand how you work with an ethical dilemma. At Counselling Tutor, we have got a library of CPD lectures, and today's topic was inspired by an ethical problem-solving lecture that is right there in our Counsellor CPD library. We have a low cost of entry for over 150 hours of really high quality lectures and hundreds of resources. If you are a counsellor, you are in practice, please go and check out our Counsellor CPD library, and you can find that by going to our mother website, which is counsellingtutor.com. All the information right there on our homepage, Rory.
Yes, well, it's been an interesting mix of topics today on the podcast. We started off with imposter syndrome, people not believing their own greatness and maybe a little bit worried that they're going to be caught out at any minute, not doing the right thing or not being competent enough. In the digital revolution, we talked about therapist boundaries, and the focus really was on new boundaries that new technology has brought us. The fact that we work online, a lot of people work online, has made us aware of different boundaries and ones that we need to look at and address. And then finally, in Practice Matters, we looked at ethical problem solving. What happens if you've got an issue that you need to really think through and make a decision on? And of course, don't forget that super duper handout on the Jonah complex that links to imposter syndrome, and that is in 167, podcast 167. So as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the digital revolution.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.